Loading. Please wait. Loading. Please wait. Loading. Please wait. For text chat with other players, press the left button to open chat. Please wait. Type message then press square to send chat. For proximity voice chat with other players, press and hold the left button while speaking. Tripus says, xglob. Loading. Loading. For text chat with Please other wait. Players, press the left button to open chat. Please wait. Type message then press square to send chat. For proximity voice chat with other players, press and hold the left button while speaking. Tripus says, xglob. Loading. Mrs. Elena says, xglob. Press the left button to open chat. Type message then press square to send chat. For proximity voice chat with other players, press and hold the left button while speaking. Tripus says, xglob. Loading. Mrs. Elena says, xglob. Nor Uagaking 1 says, featherweight. Loading. Please wait. Nor Uagaking 1 says, featherweight. Loading. Please wait. Little Ian says, xglob. Charlie VR says, xglob. Little Ian says, Jack Daniel says, xglob August 20th. Charlie VR says, xglob. Jack Daniel says, xglob August 20th. Seblay says, ex Helio. Jack Daniel says, come here, join group farm glob. Seven says, it's hello. Jack Daniel says, come here, join group farm glob. Sai1 the Prac says, XCK. Sai1 the Prac says, XCK. Healer Danny says, Reg Starstone, lobby up. Healer Danny says, Reg Starstone, lobby up. Healer Danny says, Reg Starstone, lobby up, need a tank. Healer Danny says, Reg Starstone. Jack Daniel says, X Glob September 20th. Seblay says, WTS Major Angry Earth Trophy. Jack Daniel says, X Blog September 20th. Seblay says, WTS Major Angry Earth Trophy. Seblay says, WTS Major Angry Earth Trophy. Asta23 says, X-Glob. Asta23 says, X-Glob. Chandra says, Q random mutts need tank. Chandra says, Q random mutts need tank. Jack Daniel says, X-Glob September 20th. Jack Daniel says, X-Glob September 20th. Unspa Cable Noah says, XWT. Unspa Cable Noah says, XWT. Unspa Cable Noah says, XWT. Flursive Grethi says, X-Glob. Flursive Grethi says, X-Glob. Loading. Please wait. Grethi says, X-Glob. Loading. Please wait. Crafthound says, tank needed random moot please. Null Sum 0 says, random mute need tanks. Crafthound says, tank needed random moot please. Null Sum 0 says, random mute need tanks. Crafthound says, let's kick some ass. Unspa Cable Noah says, XWT. Null Sum 0 says, random mute need tanks. Crafthound says, let's kick some ass. Unspa Cable Noah says, XWT. Unspa Cable Noah says, is there WT going on? Siwamungaprak says, XWT. Unspa Cable Noah says, XWT. Siwamungaprak says, XWT. Freaking Tilted says, LF1 Healer Gorg September 10. Unspa Cable Noah says, X Gorg Healer. Insama Gloria says, X Gorg Heal. Freaking Tilted says, Siwamungaprak says, X Gorg 10. Unspa Cable Noah says, X Gorg Healer. Insama Gloria says, X Gorg Heal. Siwamungaprak says, X Gorg. Freaking Tilted says, full. Freaking Tilted says, full. Moranu Congo says, March 10th Hive. Moranu Congo says, March 10th Hive. Zaxby says, X-Gorb. Zaxby says, X-Gorb. Jack Vanille says, X-Glob November 20th. Jack Vanille says, X-Glob November 20th. Lies 2 says, NEWT. Seblay says, Q random mutated. Lies 2 says, NEWT. Sai Wumgaprak says, XWT. Sai Wumgaprak says, XWT. Seblay says, Q random mutated. Sasha McLeod says, damn, that fart was pulling a trailer, almost pooped myself. Solo says, lol. Says, Healer Danny says, WTF. XD. Sasha McLeod says, damn, that fart was Charlie VR says, that's lovely Katie XD. Solo says, lol. Healer Danny says, WTF. XD. Charlie Healer says, that's Healer Danny says, well, tipo the morning to ya Sasha. Salo says, oh. Healer Danny says, WTF. XD. Sasha McLeod says, in crowning. Healer Danny says, ruffle. Healer Danny says, well, tipo the morning to ya Sasha. Healer Danny says, I can't with you. XD. Black Ranger says, X Cave. Sasha McLeod says, GM Bleep. Healer Danny says, rough. Healer Danny says, well, tipo the morning to ya Sasha. Healer Danny says, I can't with you. XD. Black Ranger says, X Cave. Sasha McLeod says, GM Bleep. Healer Danny says, Healer Danny says, I can't with you. Cy Wollongaprak says, X Cave. Black Ranger says, X Cave. Sasha McLeod says, Cy Wollongaprak says, X Cave. Lies 2 says, morning Sasha. Lies 2 says, morning Sasha. Sasha McLeod says, hi L2. Sasha McLeod says, hi L2. Sasha McLeod says, okay, drop the kids off at the pool. Little Ian says, X-Glob. Sasha McLeod says, hi L2. Sasha McLeod says, okay, drop the kids off at the pool. Little Ian says, X-Glob. Little Ian says, X-Glob. Sebley says, XWT Brimstone. Lies 2 says, XWT Brimstone. Little Ian says, X-Glob. Variant EZ says, XWT. Harmony Boar says, XWT Brim. Lies 2 says XWT. Little Women says Boker Bull says XWT. Blue Fighter says XWT Brin. Says XWT. Harmony Bull says XWT Brin. Boker Bull says XWT. Blue Fighter says XWT Brin. Lies 2 says, anyone inviting? Harmony Boar says, doesn't look like it. Lies 2 says, anyone inviting? Jack Daniel says, X-Glove November 20th. Harmony Boar says, doesn't look like it. Slardor says, exemplary ring, WTS. Jack Daniel says, X-Glove November 20th. Harmony Boar says, X North says, Gore Blast Boss 1 DPS. Ring, exemplary ring, WTS. Zaxby says, X Gorb. X North says, full sorry. X North says, Gore Blast Boss 1 DPS. Exemplary ring, WTS. Zaxby says, X Gorb. X North says, full sorry. X North says, Gore Blast Boss 1 DPS. Zaxby says, X Gorb. General Lee FYU says, WTS, Jewelry Matrix, X2200K. The Real D says, if anyone has time can they help me clear Amrine excavation? I need 2 more people to advance. Healer Danny says, invite me dear. General Lee FYU says, WTS, Jewelry Matrix, X2200K. The Real D Healer says, Danny says, for Amrine can they help me clear Amrine excavation? I need 2 more people to advance. The Real D says, yes. Healer Danny says, invite me dear. General Lee FYU says, WTS, Jewelry Matrix, X2200K. The Real D Healer says, Danny says, for Amrine can they help me clear Amrine excavation? I need 2 more people to advance. The Real D says, yes. Healer Danny says, invite me dear. Healer Danny says, for Amrine can they help me clear Amrine excavation? I need 2 more people to advance. The Real D says, yes. The Real D says, I need 1 more if anyone can help me, much appreciated. The Real D says, I need 1 more if anyone can help me, much appreciated. Stin says, X up Gorgol rolls. Lily Clarebrook says, happy to help with Amrine. The Real D says, Jasper Lee says, I'll help. Much appreciated. Stin says, X up Gorgol rolls. Lily Clarebrook says, happy to help with Amrine. Jasper Lee says, I'll help. Much appreciated. Stin says, X up Gorgol rolls. Lily Clarebrook says, happy to help with Amrine. Jasper Lee says, I'll help. Unspea Cable Noah says, X Gorg heal or bleed. Unspea Cable Noah says, X Gorg heal or bleed. Unspea Cable Noah says, X Gorg heal or bleed. Jerea says, X Gorg DPS. Stin says, February 10th few more Gorg. Zaxby says, X Gorg. Jerea says, X Gorg DPS. Stin says, February 10th few more Gorg. Zaxby says, X-Gorg. Jerea says, X-Gorg DPS. Stin says, February 10th, few more Gorg. Zaxby says, X-Gorg. Stin says, April 10th tank DPS. Stin says, April 10th tank DPS. Stin says, April 10th tank DPS. Meccan says, X-Gorg I have two. Seblay says, XWT Brimstone. Crafthound says, Q Random Moot. Meccan says, X-Gorg I Doni have two. One says, X-Gorg X DPS Healer, Cloth Hat, Nimble Coat, Cloth Gloves, Cloth Pants, Cloth Shoes, Rapier, Inferno. Seblay says, Lies 2 says, WT Brim. Crafthound says, Q Random Moot. Meccan says, X-Gorg I Doni One says, X-Gorg X DPS Healer, Cloth Hat, Nimble Coat, Cloth Gloves, Cloth Pants, Cloth Shoes, Rapier, Inferno. Seblay says, Lies 2 says, WT Please Brim. Wait. Crafthound says, Q Random Moot. Doni One says, X-Gorg X DPS Healer, Cloth Gloves, Cloth Pants, Cloth Shoes. Blue Fighter says, WT Brim. Please wait. Shrimps is Bugs says, XWT. Boker Bull says, XWT. A Lonely Night says, Good Morning Lies 2. X North says, XWT Brim. Blue Fighter says, WT Brim. Harmony Boar says, XWT. Shrimps is Bugs says, XWT. Boker Bull says, XWT. A Lonely Night says, Good Morning Lies 2. X North says, XWT Brim. Harmony Boar says, XWT. Coda Bear 21 says, WT Brim. A Lonely Night says, Good Morning Harmony. Coda Bear 21 says, WT Brim. Lies 2 says, good morning wilds. Harmony Boar says, GM night. A lonely night says, Suzuka Jose says, Oper. Stin says, June 10th, Gorg Tank DPS. Lies 2 says, good morning wilds. Coda Bear 21 says, WT Brim. Sedley says, XWT Brimstone. Suzuka Jose says, Oper. Stin says, June 10th, Gorg Tank DPS. Z says, XWT. Lies 2 says, Coda Bear 21 says, WT Brim. Sedley says, XWT Brimstone. Boker Bull says, XWT. Lies 2 says, WT. XWT. Rajcast says, XWT. Boker Bull says, Coda Bear 21 says, where is WT starting? Says, WT. Rajcast says, XWT. Harmony Boar says, GM Coda. Where is WT starting? Says, WT. Spade Echo says, XWT. Harmony Boar says, Rajcast says, XWT. Aisha Shetty says, XWT. Lies 2 says, XWT. I don't like this says, Gorgon's Ring, WTS. Rajcast says, Boker Bull says, XWT. Coda Bear 21 says, XWT. XWT. Sedley says, Xbokir. Says, XWT. I don't like this says, Gorgon's Ring, WTS. Penny Sprinkle says, XWT. XWT. Coda Bear 21 says, XWT. Luna says, X Sedlak. Amethyst Carpel says, X. Penny Sprinkle says, XWT. Harmony Boar says, XWT. Luna says, X Sedlak. Ardia Rain says, invite. Sedley says, Xbokir. Lies 2 says, we need a leader to start WR. Says, XWT. Lies 2 says, WT. Aisha Shetty says, XWT. Ardia Rain says, Coda Bear 21 says, XWT. Says, Xbokir. Lies 2 says, we need a leader to start WR. Lies 2 says, WT. Ardia Rain says, XWT. Verse AL says, X said lag too long. Iron Michael C says, XWT. Sedley says, well. Boker Bull says, XWT. Ardia Rain says, XWT. Verse AL says, X said lag too long. Iron Michael C says, XWT. Sedley says, well. Boker Bull says, XWT. Stin says, June 10th, Gorg Tank LR DPS. Coda Bear 21 says, XWT. Aisha Shetty says, XWT. Spade Echo says, XWT. Rajcast says, Merc is up. Hanka Troon says, X Tank 21 says, XWT. Aisha Shetty says, XWT. Spade Echo says, XWT. Lies 2 says, X Merc. Rajcast says, Merc is up. Aisha Shetty says, X Merc. Hanka Troon says, X Tank 21 says, A Lonely Night says, X Merc. WT. Aisha Shetty says, XWT. Spade Echo says, XWT. Lies 2 says, X Merc. The Savage Khan says, Hello Syndicate, it feels so good to be inside you again. Hertzer Gramps says, X Merc. Iron Michael C says, X Merc. Boker Bull says, X Merc. The Savage Khan says, X Make-A-Wish. The Savage Khan says, Hennis Sprinkle says, X Merc. Feels so good to be inside you again. Harmony Boar says, X Merc. Hertzer Gramps says, X Merc. Iron Michael C Amethyst Carpel says, X Merc. Boker Bull says, Insama Gloria says, X Merc. The Savage Khan says, X Make-A-Wish. The Savage Khan says, Hennis Sprinkle says, Variant Z says, X Merc. Harmony Boar says, X Merc. Stin says, July 10th Gore Peeler DPS. Amethyst Carpel Selja 002 says, X Glob. Insama Gloria says, Spade Echo says, X Merc. Frostinut says, X Merc. Variant Z says, Boker Bull says, X Merc. Miss Me says, X Merc. July 10th Gore Peeler DPS. Hennis Sprinkle says, X Merc. Selja 002 Jasper Lee says, X Gorg. A Lonely Night says, X Merc. Frostinut says, X Merc. Boker Bull says, X Merc. Miss Me says, X Merc. July 10th Gore Peeler DPS. Hennis Shrimps is Bug says, X Merc. Jasper Lee says, X Gorg. A Lonely Night says, X Merc. Frostinut says, X Merc. Boker Bull says, X Merc. Miss Me says, X Merc. Iron Michael C says, X Merc. Shrimps is Bug says, X Merc. Jasper Lee says, X Gorg. Buzz B says, I wish for new content. Verse AL says. Rajcast says, X Merc. Dix Maximus says, X Merc. Says, X Merc. Says, X Merc. Lies 2 says, Thai Harmony for starting GRP. Buzz B says, I wish for new content. The Savage Khan says, what kind? Verse AL says. Rajcast Harmony Boar says, YW. Dix Maximus says, X Merc. Lies 2 says, Thai Harmony for starting GRP. The Savage Khan says, what kind? Shrimps is Bug says, yes Thai. Dix Maximus says, X Merc. For starting GRP. Poker Smile says, X Gorg. Poker Smile says, X Gorg. Shrimps is Bug says, Buzz B says, new zone would be nice. A Lonely Night says, Testa X up. Camille 999 says, plus Merc says, X Gorg. Lies 2 says, High Rage. Smile says, X Gorg. Spade Echo says, Thai Harmony says, new zone would be nice. Rajcast says, right, lies. Harmony Boar says, ew. Testa X up. Rajcast says, hey. 999 says, Verse AL says, X Merc Bokir. Lies 2 says, High Rage. Testicles says, XWT. Spade Echo says, Thai Harmony says, Sir Aldous says, X Merc. Right, lies. Asta 23 says, X Merc. Healing Groom says, X Merc. Verse AL says, X Merc Bokir. Lies 2 says, Testicles says, Felicity057 says, Xmerc. Sir Aldous says, Xmerc. Asta 23 Elvin Rain 13 says, Xmerc. Healing Groom Harmony Boar says, Merc starting hyphen raid full. A Lonely Night says, X up for Harmony R2. Felicity057 JZSL says, X Globe. Sir Aldous says, Xmerc. Asta 20 Elvin Rain 13 says, Xmerc. Healing Groom Harmony Boar says, Merc starting hyphen raid full. A Lonely Night says, X up for Harmony R2. Felicity057 JZSL says, X Globe. Elvin Rain 13 says, Swizz says, Xmerc. Harmony Boar says, Merc starting hyphen raid full. Bullwinkle says, Xmerc. A Lonely Night says, X up for Harmony R2. JZSL Charlie VR says, Xmerc. Swizz says, Xmerc. Bullwinkle says, Xmerc. Charlie VR says, Xmerc. Swizz says, Xmerc. Bullwinkle says, Xmerc. Charlie VR says, Xmerc. A Lonely Night says, Harmony's Merc are July 2nd 20th. Craft Hound says, Lily. A Lonely Night Harmony Boar says, Tie Night July 2nd 20th. Gibson says, Xmerc. A Lonely Night says, You're very welcome. Craft Hound says, Lily. Ardia Rain says, XWT. Boar says, Tie Night. 929 says, Queue up for Random Moot. Sasha McLeod says, My bad Coda lol was testing junk lol. Ardia Rain says, XWT. 929 says, Queue up for Random Moot. Coda Bear 21 says, It's okay, P. Shonder says, Need tank for random mutated. Sasha Craft Hound says, Need tank Ranmoot. Testing junk lol. Craft Hound says, Lily. 929 says, Queue up for random. Coda Bear 21 says, It's okay. A Lonely Night says. Shonder says, Need tank for random mutated. Craft Hound says, Need tank Ranmoot. Craft Hound says, Lily. A Lonely Night says. Shonder says, Craft Hound says, New tank Ranmoot. Craft Hound says, Lily. A lonely night says, Lily's offline. A lonely night says. Nor you a gaking one says, X-Merc. A lonely night says, Lily's offline. Ropasenho says, X-Kata. Nor you a gaking one says, X-Merc. A lonely night says, Lily's offline. Nor you a gaking one says, X-Patista. Ropasenho says, X-Kata. Ropasenho says, X13E confirma. Nor you a gaking one says, X22 Bolsonaro vive. Ropasenho says, XL. Nor you a gaking one says, X22 Bolsonaro vive. Ropasenho says, XL. Bersha 79 says, 3 versus 3 help me KC. Brimstone Prides. ZX Dino 2 says, gas. Bersha 79 says, 3 versus 3 help me KC. Brimstone Prides. Versha79 says, R. ZX Dino 2 says, yes. Versha79 says, no men. Versha79 says, 3 versus 3 Versha79 says, R. Versha79 says, no men. Solo 1 and D says, Q random X. Solo 1 and D says, Q random X. Loading. Please wait. Nor Uagaking 1 says, the abyss. Loading. Loading. Please wait. Please wait. Nor Uagaking 1 says, the abyss. Loading. Loading. Please wait. Please wait. Harmony Boar says, WT go to mines. Please wait. Harmony Boar says, WT go to mines. Adequa says, XWT. Adequa says, XWT. Versha 79 says 3 versus 3. Dix Maximus says XA Corp. Versha 79 says 3 versus 3. Dix Maximus Butya says XWT. Codabear 21 says X. Alluvian says X Scorp. Butya says XWT. Codabear 21 says X. Alluvian says X Scorp. Ropasenho says, X Gorgivador X Ionivador X Kata. Insama Gloria says, X Scorp. Gorgivador X Ionivador X Kata. Bokerbull says, X Scrop. Ropasenho says, X Qual Kirkoisa. Bokerbull says, X Scrop. Ropasenho says, X Qual Kirkoisa. RIP says, X Gorg Core Roll. Loading. Please wait. Ropasenho says, X Gorg Evade. RIP says, X Gorg Core Roll. Please wait. Ropasenho says, X Gorg Evade. X Gorg Core Roll. Bokerbull says, XWT. Bokerbull says, XWT. RIP says, X up for Gorgima, make a trap with everyone that's up XD. Crafthound says, Plunderer's Musket. Crafthound says, Finisher. X North says, X Trap. RIP says, X up for Gorgima, make a trap with everyone that's up XD. Crafthound says, Plunderer's Musket. Crafthound says, Finisher. X North says, X Trap. Firebolt says, X Scorp. Briar says, X Trap. PA Master says, where do you craft gems? McNulty says, outfitting station. Firebolt says, X Scorp. Wigo says, I craft my gems at the trader. PA Master says, McNulty says, real. McNulty says, outfitting station. Wigo says, I craft my gems at the trader. PA Master says, McNulty says, real. McNulty says, outfitting station. I think Emanu says, that's a hint to charge more for gems because lazy people will pay. RIP says, X up for Trappy Gorg, if you don't want a trap make it not Trappy 3. I think Emanu says, that's a hint to charge more for gems because lazy people will pay. RIP says, X up for Trappy Gorg, if you don't want a trap make it not Trappy 3. Rajcast says, THXT. Rig says, X Gorg bleed. Harmony Boar says, Tyol. Rajcast says, THXT. Miss Me says, Ty Harmony. Rig says, X Gorg bleed. Harmony Boar says, Tyol. Lies 2 says, Ty Harmony. Rajcast says, THXT. Miss Me says, Ty Harmony. Harmony Boar says, 3. A Lonely Night says, 3 Harmony. Lies 2 says, Ty Harmony. Amethyst Carpel says, Ty Harmony. 3. A Lonely Night says, 3 Harmony. Harmony Boar says, you guys are the best. Tilda. Amethyst Carpel RIP says, X up for God. Azorica says, OPR. Alvin Rain 13 says, Thai Harmony. Harmony Boar says, you guys are the best. Tilda. R.I.P. says, X up for God. Azorica says, OPR. Alvin Rain 13 says, Thai Harmony. Harmony Board says, you guys are the best. R.I.P. says, X up for God. I think Emanu says, what is this server down to? 5 people willing to host E. Alvin Rain 13 says, Thai Harmony. McNulty says, something like that. Emanu says, what is this server down to? 5 people willing State to host Echo says, Thai Harmony. General Lee FYU says, WTS, Jewelry Matrix, X2200K. McNulty says, something like that. I think Emanu says, there really isn't any bleep doing private. Jewelry Matrix, X2200K. McNulty says, something like that. McNulty says, be the change fan. Brandon says, CTF anyone? Says, there really isn't any bleep doing private. I think Emanu says, I can't even party anymore. McNulty says, be the change fan. Brandon says, CTF anyone? I think Emanu says, I can't even party anymore. McNulty says, be the change fan. Brandon says, CTF anyone? I don't like this says, Gorgon's Ring, WTS. Loading. Please wait. RIP says, X up for Gorg hyphen best run in like server. Says, Gorgon's Ring, WTS. Loading. Please wait. RIP says, Alluvian is healing. Best run in server. Gorgon's Ring, WTS. Loading. Please wait. RIP says, Alluvian is healing. Best run in server. Felicity057 says, XWTR. Felicity057 says, XWT. EasyB203 says, X. Felicity057 says, XWTR. RIP says, for Gorges. Golden Luck says, X-Trib. Felicity057 says, XWT. Houst says, X-Trib. X. EasyB203 says, sure. Felicity057 Lies 2 says, X-Trib. Says, for Gorges. Amethyst Carpel says, X-Trib. Harmony Boar says, X-Trib. Elvin Rain 13 says, X-Trib. Easy B 203 says, sure. Lies 2 says, X-Trib. Chocolati says, X-Trib. Rainbow Ruby says, X-Trib. Elvin Rain 13 says, X-Trib. Grandmaster 4 says, X-Trib. Tony Loco says, X-Trib. I Think Emanu says, can't even leech behind the easy eager. People just run by the monsters, in zergs of 20-40 people X. Elvin Rain 13 says, X-Trib. Grandmaster 4 says, X-Trib. Tony Loco says, X-Trib. McNulty says, why can't you party? I Think Emanu says, can't even Spade Echo says, X-Trib. People just run by the monsters, in zergs of 20-40 people X. Lies on Cinti TV says, X-Trib. Wig says, why kill everything when you can just run past? Says, why can't you party? I Think Emanu says, too much pressure, worried about keeping up and making sure nobody is behind me. Ardia Rain says, X-Tribe. Golden Luck says, trip starting 1 minute. Nor Uagaking 1 says, X-Trib. McNulty says, what? Too much pressure. Wig says, sounds like skill issue. Nobody is behind me. I Think Emanu says, because you're in a zerg and not soloing like a little girl scared to get your skirt dirty. Trib starting 1 minute. Igor Naeus says, X-Trib. Uagaking 1 says, X-Trib. Igor Naeus says, X-Trib. McNulty says, what? McNulty says, what are you talking about fam? Like skill issue. I Think Emanu says, dodging monsters and creating retreaters is not skill, it is troll. Scared to get your skirt dirty. Bullwinkle says, X-Trib. Igor Naeus says, X-Trib. Swizz says, X-Trib. Igor Naeus says, X-Trib. I Think Emanu says, it's Valhalla, the server has always been this way, even defending themselves. I Think Emanu says, Jute Mangum says, X-Trib. Retreaters is not skill, it is troll. Scared to get your skirt dirty. Bullwinkle says, X-Trib. Igor Naeus says, X-Trib. Swizz says, X-Trib. Igor Naeus says, X-Trib. I Think Emanu says, it's Valhalla. Miss Me says, X-Trib. Even defending themselves. Jute Mangum says, X-Trib. R.I.P. says, LF Flail Person for Gorb. I Think Emanu says, I heard this server did mercs all the time, but I was not told that they only do mercs because people start mercs without establishing parties first. Says, Aisha Shetty says, X-Trib. McNulty says, what are you complaining about? I'm still unsure. I Think Emanu says, I heard this server did mercs all the time, but I was not told that they only do mercs because people start mercs without establishing parties first. Aisha Shetty says, X-Trib. McNulty says, what are you complaining about? I'm still unsure. I Think Emanu says, the unruly nature of this server. Vladnik says, X-Helio. I Think Emanu says, the unruly nature of this server. I Think Emanu says, people host WTS and Eager, only to have people bum rush and start them before anybody gets there. Vladnik says, X-Helio. Grandmaster 4 says, Helio solo. Adequa says, X-Trib. McNulty says, okay. Tinkemanu says, people host WTS indeed, but only to have people bum rush and
says,
start them
X
before
trib.
anybody gets there. Grandmaster 4 says, Helio Solo. Tinkemanu says, and running past monsters that delay the people running behind. We got rid of that bad practice in Panja. Oaks says, X trib. Golden Luck says, going trivial. Ryuyan Ki Yelwa says, X Helio. Says, and running past monsters that delay the people. Golden Luck says, trib 50% done. Practice in Panja. 6 Molio says, X Helio. Golden Luck says, going trivial. Kidyu says, X Helio. Says, X Helio. Golden Luck says, trib 50% done. 6 Molio says, X Helio. Kidyu says, X Helio. Jack Daniel says, X Helio. Seblay says, X Helio. SV Furman says, Q Oper. Jack Daniel says, X Helio. Boker Bull says, X Helio. Seblay says, X Helio. SV Furman says, Clover 01 says, X Helio. Clover 01 says, X Helio. Boker Bull says, X Helio. Jack Daniel says, X Helio in. Clover 01 says, X Helio. Clover 01 says, X Helio. Tinkemanu says, I can use ATA as an easy example. We don't have to run and create retreaters. Those things don't have that much HPS, /. Tinkemanu says, I can use ATA as an easy example. We don't have to run and create retrievers. Those things don't have that much HPS, /. Juke Mangum says, exemplary amulet, imbued exemplary amulet. Tinkemanu says, there's just no chill, and it upsets my ability to remain calm. Juke Mangum says, exemplary amulet, imbued exemplary amulet. Tinkemanu says, there's just no chill, and it upsets my ability to remain calm. Loading. Please wait. Aisha Shetty says, exemplary ring. My ability to remain calm. Loading. Please wait. Aisha Shetty says, exemplary ring. Please wait. Aisha Shetty says, exemplary. Jack Daniel says, ex Helio. Vladnik says, ex Helio. Felicity057 says, ex Helio. Jack Daniel says, ex Helio. Jute Mangum says, ex Merc. Vladnik says, ex Helio. Aisha Shetty says, exemplary ring, tie trig. Ex Helio. Clover01 says, ex Helio. Golden Luck says, trib 70% done, I'll next. Vladnik says, ex Helio. Aisha Shetty says, exemplary ring, tie trig. Clover01 says, ex Helio. Adequa says, Jangan trial goblock. Golden Luck says, trib 70% done. Void Vixen says, ex Helio. Unspeakable Noah says, Ildu Ilsa. Shrimps is Bugs says, exile. Adequa says, Jangan trial. Jute Mangum says, imbued exemplary amulet. Exemplary amulet, real trivial is good drop. Unspeakable Noah says, Ildu Ilsa. Shrimps is Bugs says, exile. Adequa says, Jangan trial. Jute Mangum says, imbued exemplary amulet. Exemplary amulet, real trivial is good drop. Seblay says, ex Helio, chaos glyph stone. Noah says, Ildu Ilsa. Shrimps is Bugs says, exile. Adequa says, Jute Mangum says, imbued exemplary amulet. Exemplary amulet, real trivial is good drop. Seblay says, ex Helio, chaos glyph stone. I think Emanu says, if you're recruiting, X/20 really helps people know. SV Furman says, K-Oper. Golden Luck says, trib done I'll in 5 min. I think Emanu says, if you're recruiting, X/20 really helps people know. SV Furman says, K-Oper. John Syadownjit says, Golden X. Luck says, trib done I'll in 5 Vladnik says, July 20th Helio. Shrimps is Bugs says, ex Helio. Nabstro says, ex Helio. Golden Luck says, R1 I'll full. SV Furman says, K-Oper. John Syadownjit says, X. Trib done I'll in 5 Vladnik says, July 20th Helio. Jute Mangum says, I'll full make another. Shrimps is Bugs says, ex Helio. Unspeakable Noah says, exile. Golden Luck says, R1 I'll full. Aisha Shetty says, exemplary amulet. Asta 23 says, X Helio. Juke Mangum says, The Burnt Peanut says, didn't loot one chest in Trib, just killed Bleep, try it October 10th. Unspeakable Noah says, Exile. Golden Luck says, Unspeakable Noah says, Exile. Says, Exemplary Amulet. Unspeakable Noah says, Asta 23 says, Ex Helio. I think Emanu says, Nice, I do notice you doing Bleep Nut. One chest in Trib, just killed Bleep, try it October 10th. Unspeakable Noah says, Unspeakable Noah says, Inv me to Isle. Unspeakable Noah says, Golden Luck says, Peanut best streamer for a reason. Isle Tuman. Lord Kalmar says, Ex Helio. Juke Mangum says, make another at Unspeakable Noah. Versha 79 says, XRT. Golden Luck says, Smiley says, be wanting to try the Isle. Lord Kalmar says, Ex Helio. Juke Mangum says, make another at Vladnik says, tie. Versha 79 says, XRT. Golden Luck says, Smiley says, I think Emanu says, oh def go run through, ask to get in first party for being a first timer. Felicity 057 says, Ex Helio. Vladnik says, tie. Vladnik says, November 20th Helio. Golden Luck says, I'll started. Smiley says, I think Emanu says, oh def go run through, ask to get in first party for being a first timer. I think Emanu says, you gotta get there when people are running to it if you aren't sure of the way. Vladnik says, November 20th Helio. Golden Luck says, I'll started. I think Emanu says, Juke Mangum says, exemplary amulet. I think Emanu says, you gotta get there when people are running to it if you aren't sure of the way. Vladnik says, November 20th Helio. Burstador says, WTS, cloth gloves. Vladnik says, December 20th Helio. Grandmaster 4 says, exemplary amulet. Sheska says, Ex Helio. Says, WTS, cloth gloves. Vladnik says, December 20th Helio. Juke Mangum says, real Elysian good drop accessories. Exemplary amulet. Golden Luck says, Juke styling on y'all. Sheska says, Null Sum Zero says, headed for Imperial X if you wanna. I think Emanu says, would totally Helio if I wasn't camping Merc. Juke Mangum says, Grandmaster 4 says, yes sure. Vladnik says, Helio about to start. Juke styling on y'all. Null Sum Zero says, headed for Imperial X if you wanna. Texas Sun says, XWT. Would totally Helio if I wasn't camping. Juke Mangum says, lol. Grandmaster 4 says, yes sure. Vladnik says, Helio about to start. Unspeakable Noah says, LX Trib. Unspeakable Noah says, Exile. Texas Sun says, I think Emanu says, there's an Isle started, Helio starting, and an imp getting going. Kaust says, Exile. General Lee FYU says, Ex Helio. Noah says, LX Trib. Unspeakable Noah says, Exile. Texas Sun says, I think Emanu says, there's an Isle Seblay says, Ex Helio, and an imp getting going. Kaust says, Exile. Kaust says, Exile. General Lee FYU says, Ex Helio. Noah says, LX Trib. Unspeakable Noah says, Exile. Texas Sun says, I think Emanu says, there's an Isle. Vladnik says, Helio starting. Kaust says, Exile. Kaust says, Exile. General Lee FYU says, Ex Helio. Seblay says, R2 Helio 14/20. Doni1 says, X Helio. Vladnik says, Helio starting. Kaust says, Exile. Seblay says, R2 Helio 14/20. Doni1 says, X Helio. Vladnik says, Helio starting. Kaust says, Exile. Seblay says, R2 Helio 14/20. Doni1 says, X Helio. Vladnik says, Helio 15/20. Vladnik says, Helio 15/20. Vladnik says, Helio 15/20. Sasha McLeod says, Thai Helio XD. I don't like this says, Gorgon's Ring, WTS. ZX Dino 2 says, Ennio Gago. Lunatera Lulu says, Exemplary Ring, Gorgon's Ring, Exemplary Amulet, 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 Exemplary Ring, Exemplary Amulet, Exemplary Ring, Exemplary Ring, Exemplary Amulet. Exemplary Ring. SV Furman says, K Ober. Exemplary Amulet. ZX Dino 2 says, Any Ober. Exemplary Amulet. Versha 79 says, Go Ober. Exemplary Amulet. Ardia Rain says, Exile. Exemplary Amulet. Exemplary Sasha McLeod says, We just ran it Vlad Thai XD. Exemplary Ring. SV Furman Vladnik says, Okay. ZX Dino 2 says, Any Ober. Exemplary Amulet. Versha 79 says, Go Ober. Exemplary Amulet. Ardia Rain says, Exile. Exemplary Amulet. Sasha McLeod says, We just ran it Vlad Thai XD. Vladnik says, Okay. ZX Dino 2 says, Any Ober. Versha 79 says, Go Ober. Ardia Rain says, Exile. I think Emanu says, So, gonna merc after them It will probably be up, I wouldn't check the map nor come here until those other eek are over. Mekan says, X-Glob. I think Emanu says, So, gonna merc after them It will probably be up, I wouldn't check the map nor come here until those other eek are over. Mekan says, X-Glob. I think Emanu says, So, gonna merc after them It will probably be up, I wouldn't check the map nor come here until those other eek are over. Mekan says, X-Glob. Aisha Shetty says, exemplary ring. Zaxby says, LF2M Kata. Aisha Shetty
Suing
says,
says,
X Glob. Zaxby says, LF2M Kata. Aisha Shetty
Suing
says,
says,
X Glob. Zaxby says, LF2M Kata. Suing says, X Glob. Lily Clearbrook says, need DPS for Rand Mutts. Harmony Boar says, X DPS Lily. Lily Clearbrook says, need DPS for Rand Mutts. Harmony Boar says, X DPS Lily. Lily Clearbrook says, need DPS for Rand Mutts. Harmony Boar says, X DPS Lily. A Lonely Knight says, 23 mins queued as tank for randoms, / Dexful says, X Merc. Aisha Shetty says, exemplary ring. I Tinkemanu says, wish they would turn the score counter things on again. I finally got an outfit that I don't switch out as often as the others. 23 mins queued as tank for randoms, / Dexful says, X Merc. I Tinkemanu says, Dex there are a few eager going on that might want to merc when they are done. I Tinkemanu says, wish they would turn the score counter things on again. I finally got
Aisha
an
Shetty
outfit that I
says,
don't
next
switch out as
siren.
often as the others. 23 mins queued as tank for randoms, / Yu Mato says, XWT. Tinkemanu says, Dex there are a few eager going on that
Grandmaster 4 says, X siren.
I Tinkemanu says, oh maybe not, Merc started. Says, next siren.
A Lonely Knight says, X siren.
Bootya says, XWT. Yu Mato says, XWT. Tinkemanu says, Dex there are a few eager going on that Grandmaster 4 says, X siren. I Tinkemanu says, oh maybe not, Merc started. Unspea Cable Noah says, exemplary earring, so how does this work? Bootya says, XWT.
Spade Echo says, X siren.
Boker Bull says, X siren. Bootya says, X siren. Lizon Sinti TV says, X siren.
How does this work?
Bootya says XW.
Spade Echo says X Siren.
Boker Bull says X
Yu
Siren.
Mato says X Siren.
Bootya says X Siren.
Lizon Sinti TV says X Siren.
So how does this work?
Boker Bull says X Siren. A Lonely Night says X Siren.
Yu Mato says X Siren. Bootya says X Siren.
Grandmaster 4 says X Siren. Spade Echo says XC8 Ren.
X Siren.
Lamoy says X Siren.
Says X Siren.
Aisha Shetty says Siren leaving in 3 minutes. Swizz says X Siren.
Grandmaster
Lies 2 says X Siren. Unspea Cable Noah says exemplary earring. How does this work?
Lamoy says X Siren. Aisha Shetty says Siren leaving in 3 minutes. Swizz says X
Loading.
Siren.
Please wait.
Grandmaster Lies 2 says X Siren. Unspea Cable Noah says
Select character
exemplary
screen.
earring. How does this work?
Press square to continue. Select character screen. Press square to select Wizard King.
Swizz says
Loading.
Siren.
Please wait.
Lies 2 says X Siren. Unspea Cable Noah says
Select character
exemplary
screen.
earring. How does this work?
Press square to continue. Select character screen. Press square to select Wizard King.
Loading. Please wait. Lies 2 says X Siren. Unspea Cable Noah says
Select character screen.
How does this work?
Press square to continue. Select character screen. Press square to select Wizard King.
Siren. Unspea. Swizz says X
Loading.
Siren. Swizz says X
Loading.
Siren.